Thank you so much for that introduction, John. So I'll just share my screen. And before I get started, I wanted to also acknowledge that I'm on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples here in Vancouver, Canada. Okay, so yes, my talk is how do settler-colonial inequalities shape political behavior and communication in Anglo democracies? And I'm actually, sorry, I'll begin my talk by giving some background into why this line of research matters. And then I'm going to give kind of a broad overview of some of the main findings from two separate studies that I conducted. So the first study that I'll talk about today looks at settlers' racial attitudes and their political behavior, especially their voting behavior. And the second study is more related to discourse, kind of reason giving. And I look at how intergroup disagreement in online communication impacts settlers' outgroup attitudes. And then I'll finish my talk with a discussion and conclusion with the implications of my main findings. Okay, so starting first with a bit of background about why this topic matters for the study of politics and political communication in Anglo democracies. And so I've made the case in my research, and I would maintain that race and racism has been central to the political development in all Anglo settler democracies. So, places like Canada, Australia, the United States. And here I've presented a quote from P.J. Anderson, who is Canada's Indian Affairs Superintendent, who is explaining to of Indigenous elders why their children were going to be taken away and sent to what we call residential schools, or what in the United States are called boarding schools. And so P.J. Anderson said, "Your children shall be sent to schools where they will forget their Indian habits and be instructed in the necessary arts of civilized life and become one with your white brethren." And so here, what Anderson is expressing is first, I want you to note that he's making reference to two separate groups. So first, there's Indigenous peoples, the Outgroup, who pose a real threat to what he is portraying as kind of white civilization. And he's talking about the necessity of assimilating Indigenous peoples into what he describes as civilized white, or civilized life, so the life of the kind of white in-group. Now, as we know, and what Indigenous peoples have been saying for years, is these schools were not just places where Indigenous children were indoctrinated into kind of white European values. Many Indigenous peoples and Indigenous children never went home. So last summer and throughout the course of the last year, there have been a series of discoveries of many unmarked graves. So this is a figure that's showing the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which is not far from where I'm giving my talk right now, where this past summer, 215 unmarked graves of Indigenous children were discovered. And throughout the course of the summer, many more graves were found at a series of schools. And so I think this is just really a horrific testament to the threat that Indigenous peoples posed to the kind of political expansion and development of the Canadian political state. And these settler-colonial tensions, I would argue, continue to be a defining feature of political life in Canada and other settler-colonial states today. So with respect to the existing literature on how racial attitudes impact attitudes in settler colonies, there's a really large body of research on the political consequences of anti-Black attitudes in the United States. So this has been really where a lot of the research has been conducted. And there's been really a focus on symbolic racism, measured as what's called racial resentment. So this is racial resentment towards Black Americans. And racial resentment is operationalized as a kind of a combination of anti-Black affect and the belief that Black Americans violate cherished values related to industry and self-sufficiency. However, there has been a growing interest in looking more specifically at settlers' attitudes towards Indigenous peoples, negative attitudes, kind of stereotype endorsement, and so on, as well as in other settler colonies like Canada. So there has been some growing literature on this field in the past 8 or so years, including some research that I've conducted. And more recently, there has been this growing interest in the role of white in-group attachments in the United States, so white in-group attitudes, and other settler colonies like Canada. And so I just want to take a moment to note that, and one of the claims that I'm going to make and show with my research is that negative outgroup evaluations and attachment to an in-group, like the white in-group, are distinct sets of phenomena that have different political consequences, although they work in tandem to reinforce settler-colonial inequalities. Okay, so with respect to the research questions that I'm going to try and address at kind of a very high level in my brief talk today. One is this question of how racial in-group and out-group attitudes shape voting behavior among white settlers in Canada. So I'll talk about that in study 1. And then the second question that I'm interested in is more about, how do we change out-group attitudes? And more specifically, I want to look at whether online reason giving about public issues can impact settlers' out-group attitudes, and in particular, whether we can improve out-group attitudes using a specific communication style. And so what I'm going to look at is whether kind of a narrative personal storytelling can improve out-group attitudes in contrast to like maybe a more kind of traditional rational legal style set of reason giving. So, and I'll look at that in study 2. Okay, so beginning first with study 1, racial attitudes and political behavior, or more specifically, voting behavior. In this study, I also looked at policy preferences, but I'm not gonna have time to talk about that today, although I have extra slides, I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. So just first, looking at racial attitudes and vote choice. So I hypothesized that among white settlers, their resentment towards Indigenous peoples will be associated with voting for right of center parties, in particular with the Conservative Party of Canada. And I drew this hypothesis just given the existing literature on the topic. And I also hypothesized that white identity is associated with voting for parties with a larger white voter base. And so in the Canadian context, and I'll just explain this for a second for those of you who are not familiar with Canadian politics. So in Canadian politics, we have the more left-leaning party, the Social Democratic Party, which is the NDP. We have the center-left party, which is the Liberals. Then we have the center-right party, which is the Conservatives. And of these three kind of main parties that run candidates across the country, the Conservatives have the largest proportion of people who identify as conservative voters who are white. So I'm going to hypothesize that people who identify as conservative voters, or that people who vote conservative are people who have higher white identity are more likely to vote conservative. And then this last column here, those of you who don't know much about Canadian politics might not be familiar, but this fourth party is the Bloc Québécois. And this is the sort of Quebec nationalist party that only runs in the French region of Canada, in Quebec. And it advocates for greater kind of sovereignty or maybe even separatism of Quebec from the rest of Canada. So this is the kind of pro-Quebec sovereigntist party that only runs in the French region of Quebec. And we can see actually they have the widest voter base, people who identify as Bloc Québécois voters. And so I'm also going to hypothesize that in Quebec, white identity is going to be associated with voting for the Bloc. Okay, with respect to the methods that I used for study 1, I used data that was drawn from that was part of the Canadian Election Studies 2019. And I won a competition to include a special module on white identity. And I ended up getting a representative sample of white Canadian citizens who completed the white identity module, as well as some other questions from the Canadian election study in October of 2019. And the outcome that I'm going to talk about today is this variable that asks, or this question that asks respondents, which party do you think you'll vote for? The Liberal, the NDP, Conservatives, other parties in Canada outside of Quebec. And in the province of Quebec, the French-speaking region, they also asked, the Bloc Québécois is also an option. And then I did multinomial logistic regressions of vote choice on white identity and Indigenous resentment towards Indigenous people, controlling for important confounders. And I did separate analyses of Quebec and rest of Canada, so Canada outside of Quebec, which is the convention in Canadian politics, just because there's two different party systems in those two regions. Oops, let me go back for, okay, oh yeah. And so in order to measure white identity, so one of my two main independent variables, looking at racial attitudes. So white identity is my measure of attachment to that white in-group among white settlers. And so what I did is I drew on the American literature on white identity politics from Ashley Jardina, who did this study. She has a book called, I think it's called White Identity Politics, where she has these 3 items that ask how important is being white to your identity, white people in this country have a lot to be proud of, and whites in this country have a lot in common with one another. And so using those 3 items, I created a summated scale, which I then standardized. And I'll talk about how to interpret standardized scales when I discuss my results. So that's my measure of white identity, one of my 2 main independent variables in the analysis. The second independent variable in analysis that I'm interested in is measuring settlers' resentment towards Indigenous peoples. So here I used 5 items that were included in the Canadian election studies. So I'm happy to talk about measuring resentment towards Indigenous peoples more in the Q&A. These are not all of the items that I would recommend using specifically, although this first item is one that I included. The rest were already included on the Canadian election study, and so they just gave those questions to me. And they use the language of Aboriginal, so that's why I have that wording here. And so these questions ask about Indigenous peoples getting resentment about Indigenous people asking for land rights, whether Indigenous peoples have gotten less than they deserve. And these questions were all coded or reverse coded such that higher scores, more agreement or disagreement indicates more resentful attitudes. Other questions asks about whether Indigenous people should work their way up without special favors, whether the government does not show enough respect, and about whether generations of colonialism and discrimination make it hard for Indigenous peoples to work their way out of the lower class. And this again would have been reverse coded. So again, these 5 items were included in a summated scale, which was then standardized. And these I controlled for things like partisanship, so attachment to political parties, gender, age, income, education, and living in a rural or urban area. I also, if you want to ask in the Q&A, I, as robustness check, controlled for various other items, which I'm happy to talk about. So if you have any burning questions, you think I've forgotten something, feel free to ask during the Q&A, and probably I have control for it. Okay, so going through the results from study 1. So these are showing you the results. This is the predicted probability. I've just graphed the predicted probabilities of voting for a given party by the distribution of white identity in this case. So across the x-axis here, this is the distribution of white identity. So as I mentioned earlier, this scale is standardized. So a 0 on the scale does not mean no white identity. All that a 0 means is the average level of white identity for the sample. And positive values means that somebody scores higher than average on white identity. And negative values means someone scored lower than average levels of white identity for the sample average. So what this is showing us, and this is showing us the probability of voting for a given party by the distribution of white identity. So let's look at, for instance, the probability of voting conservative in this first panel here. So if we look at 0, so that's the average white identity for, kind of a Canadian in my sample, there's about a 0.25 or 25% chance, predicted probability of voting conservative for a person who scores average levels of white identity, controlling for these kind of typical confounders. And we can see that as white identity increases, so for someone who scores, a 1 standard deviation higher than average level of white identity, now there's about a 30% predicted probability that that respondent votes conservative. So higher levels of white identity are associated with a higher probability of voting conservative. So in Canada outside of Quebec, there is an association between white identity and voting conservative, but it is not a very large association. By contrast, if we were to still look at Canada outside of Quebec, but look at the predicted probability of voting by Indigenous resentment, oops, I went too far, there it is. So this is the probability. So across this x-axis, this is showing the distribution of resentment towards Indigenous peoples. And again, 0 doesn't mean no Indigenous resentment. 0 means average level of resentment towards Indigenous people among settlers for the sample average. And here we can see that for someone who scores, the sample average of Indigenous resentment, there is again about a 0.25 or 25% predicted probability of voting conservative. But now we can see that if we increase 1 standard deviation above the sample average, so somebody who scores 1 standard deviation of higher than average resentment towards Indigenous peoples has actually about a 40% predicted probability, 40% likelihood of voting conservative. So there's actually a very powerful association between resentment towards Indigenous peoples and voting for the Conservative Party in Canada outside of Quebec. Now, lastly, the last result I'm going to talk you through is looking within the region of Quebec, the province of Quebec, Canada's French-speaking region. And here, what's notable is the association between, this is the distribution of white identity and the probability of voting for any given party. The Bloc Québécois, so again, that's the kind of sovereigntist, kind of Quebec nationalist party, Conservatives, Liberal, NDP, or other. And here we can see that for the sample average, so score of 0 of white identity, there is about, say, 13% probability of voting for the Bloc Québécois. But increasing 1 standard deviation above the sample average on white identity increases the predicted probability of voting for the Bloc Québécois to over 25%, more like close to 30% predicted probability of voting for the Bloc. So there's a very strong association between white identity and voting for the Sovereigntist Party or the Quebec Nationalist Party. But there is actually no association at all between anti-Indigenous attitudes and vote choice in the region of Quebec. So that helps to answer this first question of how racial in-group and out-group attitudes shape voting behavior from study 1. And now I'm going to turn my attention to study 2, which is more interested in, okay, well, given that we have this distribution of attitudes, we have, negative attitudes towards Indigenous people across Canada and other settler colonial societies. Given that we have these attitudes and given that we have to engage in politics, how can we improve outgroup attitudes? So here I've looked at whether kind of a deliberative style communication online, like online reason giving about public issues, can improve settlers' outgroup attitudes. And in particular, I want to know whether communication style matters and if we can sort of harness the power of personal storytelling to improve settlers' attitudes towards Indigenous peoples. So that's the question that I'm looking at with study 2. And for this study, I have hypothesized that in online discourse, kind of reason giving about public issues, rational legal style counter arguments from an outgroup member, from an Indigenous speaker, is actually going to increase settlers' resentments towards Indigenous peoples. That's my first hypothesis. And in my second hypothesis, what I really want to see is whether personal storytelling can sort of induce empathy and actually reduce settlers' resentments towards Indigenous peoples, so improve outgroup attitudes. With respect to the literature on this subject, with respect to looking at online communication specifically, research shows that just mere exposure to disagreement over social media can contribute to polarization. But of course, the deliberative Democrats in the room will point out that just exposure to disagreement is not the same thing as more discursive or deliberative exchanges. But even with respect to deliberating across intergroup boundaries, there have been theorists have pointed to the potential challenges of intergroup deliberation. So Dryzek and O'Flynn have pointed out in different pieces that deliberation requires reciprocity. And if the norm of reciprocity is absent, how can we motivate people to even engage in deliberation in the first place? And there's also really mixed empirical evidence. So there is some evidence that reason giving and personal storytelling can improve intergroup attitudes. But there's also some research that shows that intergroup deliberation can worsen outgroup attitudes and lead to polarization. And what I'm asking in this research is whether the communication style matters. And if maybe part of the reason for these mixed findings is that there's certain communication styles that's more kind of traditional, rational, legalistic communication might worsen outgroup attitudes, and whether that more kind of personal narrative storytelling can improve outgroup attitudes. With respect to the importance and the promise of personal storytelling, here I'm drawing on more feminist scholars and decolonial scholars, as well as Indigenous scholars who've talked about the importance of things like testimonial, kind of like telling personal stories from the positionality of the disempowered, and also within Indigenous communities and Indigenous theorists talk about the importance of Indigenous storytelling for Indigenous communities. And the citation here is related to Anishinaabe storytelling. And there's a distinction, of course, between sacred narratives as well as more personal stories. And what I'm looking at in this research is more of the kind of personal storytelling. Okay, so for study 2, my methods, I used an online survey experiment to get at the causal effect of hearing a counter argument in a different communication style from an outgroup member. I recruited a panel of English-speaking settlers, and I told them that the study was about the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So this is a proposed expansion of an existing pipeline that goes from Canada's oil-producing region in Alberta to the coastline. This is actually a picture from Burnaby Mountain. This is where I work, Simon Fraser University. It's just down the way, just a few kilometers away, where the crude oil goes and then is sent off in tankers. So it's going to double the amount of crude oil that makes its way to the Pacific coast. So it's a very controversial proposal. And for the experimental procedure, there are 3 steps. So first, we asked respondents their opinion on the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So whether respondents strongly agree, strongly supported somewhat, supported a little, opposed somewhat, or opposed strongly. And here you can see that there are more respondents who supported the pipeline than opposed it. In the second stage, regardless of whether people supported the pipeline or opposed it, I randomly assigned them to hear a counter argument from an Indigenous actor on a YouTube video. So for those respondents who support the pipeline, either strongly, somewhat, or a little, they're randomly assigned to either get a kind of rational legal counter argument, anti-pipeline counter argument, a personal storytelling anti-pipeline counter argument, or a placebo. Among those respondents who opposed the pipeline to begin with, I randomly assigned them to get a kind of rational legal pro-pipeline counter argument. So again, it's counter to what they believe, a personal storytelling pro-pipeline counter argument, or a placebo. And then, so they got the treatment, which is this YouTube video where they watch the Indigenous speaker present the counter argument in a different communication style, or a placebo video where the speaker talks about something unrelated to pipelines. And then in the third step, I measured the outcome, which is resentment towards Indigenous peoples. Okay, with respect to the results, here what I'm showing you in these two graphs, I'll talk you through them. It's the difference of means in the resentment scores from the placebo. So I'm going to show you one at a time. So this first graph on the left, these are respondents who are pro-pipeline. And these respondents either got a rational legal anti-pipeline counter-argument, or they got, which I expected to activate negative outgroup attitudes, or they got this personal storytelling anti-pipeline argument, which I was hoping would improve attitudes towards Indigenous people, so reduce Indigenous resentment. And what we can see from these bars, so positive values means that the people who got the treatment had higher levels of Indigenous resentment compared to the placebo. And we can see that for both of these, for those who got the rational legal as well as the storytelling counterargument, both these values are positive, which means that for both communication styles, the treatment it looks like it activated a bit of Indigenous resentment. So that's contrary to my hypothesis regarding storytelling. But these confidence intervals cross the 0 line, so it's not statistically significant. Over in this graph, it's a similar story, except that these are just respondents who were anti-pipeline to begin with, and they received the pro-pipeline counter-argument, either a rational legal counter-argument or personal storytelling counter-argument. And again, it looks like hearing this counter-argument from, regardless of the communication style, if anything, it appears to have activated slightly Indigenous resentment, but again, these results are not significant. So there's no difference between the treatment and the placebo. I also, however, wanted to look to see whether there was an interaction between the strength of the respondents' initial position. So again, remember, respondents were allowed to say they strongly supported, somewhat supported, or only supported a little bit the pipeline, and same with whether they opposed the pipeline. So I looked to see if there is an interaction between the treatment, so getting the counter argument, and the strength of their prior opinion. And I did find evidence of a significant interaction among respondents who are pro-pipeline and who got the rational counter-argument. So among people who were initially pro-pipeline, if they had stronger opinions on the pipeline and they got the rational legal counter-argument, they expressed significantly more resentment towards Indigenous peoples as compared to those who got the placebo. And this is not true for those who got the personal storytelling counterargument. So confirming my hypothesis, or congruent with my hypothesis that hearing a counterargument in the rational legal style can activate Indigenous resentment, I found that was true among respondents who were pro-pipeline to begin with. And at least for respondents who are pro-pipeline to begin with, it seems that this kind of personal storytelling may have mitigated some of this effect, although it did not improve outgroup attitudes. Okay, so in conclusion, study 1 sort of helped clarify the political consequences of in-group white identity, as well as out-group resentment towards Indigenous peoples on voter behavior. And this kind of reinforces the theoretical intuition that white identity, so in-group attitudes, are distinct from out-group attitudes, from settlers' negative evaluations of or feelings towards Indigenous peoples. I have found that settlers' sense of resentment towards Indigenous peoples is more strongly associated with vote choice in Canada outside of Quebec, specifically with voting Conservative. So white identity is associated also with voting Conservative in Canada outside of Quebec, but it's not as strong a predictor. But white identity is quite strongly associated with vote choice in Quebec. However, it's associated with voting for the Sovereigntist Party, the kind of Quebec Nationalist Party, and it is not associated with voting conservative in Quebec. With respect to study 2, my work points to the limits of short online interventions for improving settlers' outgroup attitudes. I've shown that rational legal counter-arguments in these kind of online videos, like YouTube videos, can actually activate negative outgroup attitudes. And I've shown that storytelling through social media videos does not reduce negative outgroup attitudes, so which is what I was hoping to find an intervention that could effectively improve outgroup attitudes. But at the same time, you know, this storytelling, it did not activate more negative outgroup attitudes. So potentially was perhaps mitigating some of the negative effects of hearing a counter argument from a member of an outgroup. So that's everything for my talk today. Thank you very much.